Cant Review, print speaking to the blind, celebrating 40 years of audio newspaper production. Welcome to this week's edition of the Herald Scotland podcast, recorded at the Bishop Briggs Media Centre by our amazing volunteers. You can get in touch with us via Facebook, Twitter or Instagram using @CuneReview, that is @CuneReview. You can also contact us directly by emailing information@cunereview.com, that is INFOR@CUNEREVIEW.com, or by calling 0141 772 3976, that's 0141 772 3976.
From the Herald Scotland, Wednesday the 6th of September, from the news section, HUMZA YOUSAF, wealth tax possible due to pressure on public finances. Article written by Tom Gordon, political editor, and read today by me, Ian. HUMZA YOUSAF has said the Scottish Government could introduce a wealth tax to help cope with the extraordinary pressures on the public finances. The First Minister said it would be wrong to rule out the measure and cited a recent STUC report which reports raising £1.4 billion a year by targeting the richest in society. We shouldn't rule these matters out because we are facing extraordinary pressures, he said. Mr YOUSAF was speaking after his programme for government statement to Holyrood on Tuesday fueled speculation about tax rises in the budget for 2024-25. He gave SNP Finance Secretary Shoni Robertson the task of using tax powers to ensure the budget was part of the most progressive tax system in the UK. That led to opposition party criticism that the SNP was planning to pick workers' pockets with income tax increases, with Scotland the highest taxed part of the UK. On a visit to the Thistle Foundation charity in Edinburgh for people with long-term health issues, Mr YOUSAF said progressive taxation was a central belief for him. However, he also said that if the UK government cut tax, Scotland would have to consider whether tax divergence with the UK could become problematic. Previous studies have warned high earners might change their tax residence to south of the border. Taking questions from the media, he said, "I want to make sure we continue to have a progressive tax system in Scotland. Those who earn the most, like politicians, should pay the most. That is my central belief. When it comes to it, whether we raise taxes or not, that decision will be taken during the budget. We will consider what we need to do in terms of our own budget. But we will also need to consider, clearly, what the UK government does in relation to tax, and that could also influence what we end up doing. But we won't shift away from a progressive tax system where those who earn the most pay the most." Mr YOUSAF cited a report by Landman Economics for the STUC last year, which discussed a series of ways of Holyrood could use its existing powers to raise more tax. These included a new income tax rate of 44p for earnings between £75,000 and £125,140, to raise around £200 million a year, which Mr YOUSAF has already endorsed. Another proposal was a 1% annual tax on wealth, including homes and other property, pension wealth, possessions including household contents, jewellery and art. Applying the levy on wealth above £1 million would affect 12% of households and raise around £1.4 billion, with the average household affected paying around £8,000 a year. The report said that if designed as a local rather than a national tax, it could be created under existing powers and, if work started in 2023, it could be in place by 2026-27. The Scottish Greens, the SNP's partners in the joint government, also advocate a 1% annual tax on all wealth and assets above the £1 million threshold, including property, land, pensions and other assets. Asked if wealth taxes might be a good way to raise more for services without squeezing middle earners, Mr YOUSAF said, "I've said before, when it comes to the issue of wealth taxes, and I refer back to some of the work the STUC has done in that particular, I've said we should give consideration when it comes to really tight, tough financial constraints that we are under, We shouldn't rule wealth taxes off the table. We haven't made a decision on them, but I equally have said that we shouldn't rule these matters out because we are facing extraordinary pressures. And for anti-poverty organisations, social care providers, many others who want us understandably to go further, well, we've got to be able to find the finances and the resources to do that. As to his concern about Scotland's tax regime diversion from the rest of the UK, aligned him with Scottish Tory leader Douglas Ross, Mr YOUSAF said, "Absolutely not. Douglas Ross has never believed in progressive taxation, much to my frustration. I believe in progressive taxation. We will make a decision on that come the budget." And that article was by political editor Tom Gordon. From the Herald Scotland, Wednesday the 6th of September. From the politics section, SNP MP carpeted by Speaker for intemperate language. By Andrew Learmonth. The SNP's Chris Law has been carpeted by the Speaker after he described Labour and Conservatives as two cheeks of the same arse during Prime Minister's questions. Lindsay Hoyle told the Dundee West MP to be more temperate in his language. During the session, Mr Law told the Commons that the Scottish Government was spending millions mitigating UK Government welfare policies, which he said were now supported by Labour. It follows Sir Keir Starmer's commitment over the summer to keep the two-child benefit cap brought in by George Osborne. The policy means that households claiming child tax credit or universal credit are unable to claim for a third or subsequent child born after the 6th of April 2027. Mr Law said ministers in Edinburgh had allocated £84 million to support hard-working families against the brutal bedroom tax and over £6.2 million covering the two-child benefit. The MP went on, "Astonishingly, Mr Speaker, we have learned over the summer the Leader of the Opposition is an enthusiastic supporter of these Tory cruel welfare policies with U-turn after U-turn from the Labour Party. So, given that the Tories and Labour are two cheeks of the same arse, offering no change." He was then told to sit down by Mr Hoyle. "Can I just say, let's think about language," the Speaker said. "Let's be more temperate. Let's make sure that this Parliament can be proud. The pride of this Parliament will shine through, but certainly not using language like that." "I'm happy to change the offending word with bottom," Mr Law said. He continued, "Given that Tories and Labour are two cheeks of the same bottom, offering no change, no vision and no hope, does the Prime Minister agree that the only way for Scottish voters to rid themselves of these heinous policies is to vote SNP to leave Westminster?" Rishi Sunak said the thrust of the SNP politician's question was directed at the Leader of the Opposition rather than me. "I would want to get in the middle of that," the Prime Minister added. "But all I can say is we want to ensure the welfare system is compassionate and looks after the vulnerable in our society while supporting those who can enter work to do so, because that's also fair for everyone else and British taxpayers. I believe that is a system we are achieving, Mr Speaker, and, right now, we're providing thousands of pounds of support to help with energy bills and everything else to people in Scotland, and we will continue to do so." And that report was by Andrew Learmonth.
This is from the Herald Scotland of Wednesday the 6th of September 2023, from the business section. Cold home deaths in Scotland double during the cost of living crisis. This article is by Martin Williams. Winter deaths caused by cold homes are estimated to have nearly doubled in Scotland in a year during the cost of living crisis. The concerns come as it emerged the total number of excess winter deaths in Scotland, which covers a 4-month period from December to March, has soared from 1,320 in 2021-2022 to 2,424 in 2022-23. New analysis using the official data on excess winter deaths that is due to be presented to MPs today states that 521 people are estimated to have passed away while living in a cold, damp home in Scotland in 2022-2023. The study takes in Institute of Health Equity methodology that suggests 21.5% of excess winter deaths are caused by living in cold homes, and has raised new concerns that not enough is being done to support those struggling to make ends meet. According to the estimate seen by the Herald, just 284 would have died as a result of cold homes in 2021-22. Excess winter deaths accounts for the difference between the number of fatalities during the winter months and the average number of deaths during the preceding and following months. End Fuel Poverty Coalition, which is due to present the estimates to the House of Commons Select Committee on Energy, said urgent steps were needed to bring down bills and to make our homes more energy efficient. Energy Action Scotland said that a coherent plan was needed immediately before hundreds more Scots die from cold homes this winter. It comes after it emerged that some 1,200 more Scots were taken to hospital suffering from hypothermia last year as the nation suffered the brunt of the cost of living crisis. Scottish Ambulance Service data reveals that an average of 200 patients a week were taken to hospital last year with hypothermia, classed as a temperature of less than 35 centigrade. Some 10,241 people needed treatment in 2022-23. That's 1,254 more than in the last pre-pandemic year of 2019-20. The overwhelming bulk of the cases were in the autumn to winter months, where the numbers soared by over 1,000, from 5,049 to 6,062. Simon Francis, coordinator of the End Fuel Poverty Coalition, said any rise in excess winter deaths needs to be looked at in detail by policymakers. We believe that the year-on-year rise has been caused by a colder winter than the year before and the cost of living crisis forcing people to live in cold, damp homes. While we can't always predict the weather, politicians can take steps to make our energy cheaper and our homes more energy efficient. This means improving long-term programs and ensuring they are adequately funded. Equally, if the UK government does not take action to lower energy bills for the most vulnerable, then the burden will fall on the NHS. This means that Scottish ministers must ensure that crisis planning in case of a cold winter happens now, and all efforts are taken to drive down the suffering people could face this winter. Households are due to see a fall in their energy bills from October the 1st, after a drop in the price cap, which limits how much suppliers can charge households for each unit of gas and electricity that they use. A typical household had been paying £2,074 a year on their dual-fuel gas and electricity bill. That is due to fall to £1,923 between October and December, according to the regulator Ofgem. But that is still nearly twice the amount that was set by Ofgem 3 years ago. And this winter there is no sign of the reintroduction of a £400 energy bill support scheme to help households through this winter. An estimated 28 million households received a £66 or £67 monthly discount on their energy bills between October 22 and March 23 under the scheme. More than 3,000 have signed a UK government and parliament petition calling for the reinstatement of the scheme. Fraser Scott, Chief Executive of Energy Action Scotland, said if the same number of people in Scotland were dying every day of winter on the roads or by any other means, I can only imagine that we would be admitting that we are facing an unacceptable crisis requiring urgent action. These numbers are people from across Scotland who died because of cold, damp homes. Neighbours, members of our communities who couldn't afford to heat their home to a basic level to cook hot food, boil a kettle or run a hot bath. These people were all in receipt of the government support that went to every household last winter, when energy prices were only marginally higher than they are today, and in all likelihood they weren't facing the catastrophic levels of personal debt accrued on energy bills last winter by hundreds of thousands of Scottish households who are facing this winter in the most grievous situation. Yet again we are approaching winter without a coherent plan for how and when we will support the most vulnerable households to ensure that those with long-term conditions, disabled people, households who have increased energy needs because of medical conditions and support equipment can afford the energy they need. There are things we can do in Scotland, and we must have commitment to act now before we condemn thousands more Scots to die this winter. According to Scottish Government modelling estimates, from October 22, there were around 860,000 households in fuel poverty in Scotland, around 35% of homes. That is 247,000 more than in 2019, when the last Scottish House Conditions Survey showed 613,000 households were in fuel poverty, around 25% of homes. Fuel poverty relates to households that must spend a high proportion of their household income to keep their home at a reasonable temperature. It is affected by three key factors: a household's income, their fuel costs, and their energy consumption, which in turn is affected by the energy efficiency of the home. It is defined in Scotland that after housing costs, the total fuel costs needed to maintain a satisfactory heating regime are more than 10% of the household's total taxable income. An analysis from February 22 showed that levels of fuel poverty in Scotland range from 19% in East Renfrewshire, 26% in West Lothian, and 27% in Mid Lothian, to 47% in Highland and 46% in Argyll and Bute. A UK Department for Energy Security and Net Zero spokesman said, "We recognise people are concerned about cost of living challenges, and we will continue to support vulnerable households with their energy bills." The government spent around £40 billion covering half a typical household's energy bill over the winter, and additional help is available for the most vulnerable through an increase to the Warm Home Discount, from which we expect over 3 million households to benefit. Energy prices have now fallen significantly, and we are keeping options under review, including for the most vulnerable households. The UK government said it had increased the Warm Homes Discount to £150 during 2022 to 2023. This was available on top of other government support, which included a £900 payment for those on means-tested benefits, £300 for pensioners, and an extra £150 available for disabled people. Energy Minister Gillian Martin said, "The Scottish Government has done and continues to do everything within our power to support the many thousands of households who continue to struggle with their energy bills. This includes tripling our fuel insecurity fund to £30 million this year in order to support even more people facing unprecedented energy costs. The UK government has continually failed to take the necessary steps to support people now and make the necessary changes, which only it can take, to ensure households and businesses never experience an energy crisis like this again. With subsidised support under the Energy Price Guarantee having ended in July, it now has the means and opportunity to provide meaningful targeted support for those that need it the most, including the introduction of a social tariff."
This is from the Herald on Thursday the 7th of September 2023, from the news section. Spain studying importing Scottish potatoes amid shortage fears. This article is written by Craig Williams. Representatives of the governments of the Canary Islands and Spain are looking to Scotland to help solve a potential potato shortage in the Spanish archipelago. Shipments of potatoes to the islands from England have stopped due to the presence of a plague of Colorado beetles in crops. It comes after the Colorado beetle pest was found in a Kent potato field in July, making it the first UK appearance of the beetle since 1977. According to Canarian Weekly, England is the main importer of potatoes in the archipelago, with over 86% of the imports of vegetables, plants, roots and tubers last year. The president of the Association of Seed and Crop Potato Distributors of Las Palmas, ADIPA, Juan Luis Pulido, said, "We are screwed. England provides a huge amount of potatoes that it will not be possible to replace in the coming weeks from other countries. Those markets are not prepared to make a harvest of such magnitude in such a short time. Right now, we are looking at every market we can, but it is complicated." The Canarian government are reported to be looking to replace the loss of supply from England with that of Scotland and other parts of the UK, alongside countries such as Israel, Cyprus, Egypt and Malta. La Voce de Lanzarote said the majority of the potato supply heading for the archipelago in October will arrive mainly from Scotland. Meanwhile, fears of a potato shortage in the Canary Islands has led to markets experiencing a rise in prices above the €3 per kilo, compared to a normal price of €1.2 per kilo. That article was written by Craig Williams.
From the Herald Scotland, Thursday the 7th of September, from the sports section, Lager Bielke on the awesome experience of silencing Rangers and Ibrox. Report by Mark Walker. Celtic star Gustav Lagerbielke has revealed he was delighted to silence Ibrox at the weekend after admitting they went into the Old Firm game under real pressure. Andy's had a lowdown in Celtic this week from international teammate and former Hoops hero Carl Starfelt. The former Elfsborg stopper has become an important member of the Hoops team after Celtic's defensive injury problems and was a key player in a 1-0 win over Rangers, partnering Liam Scales at the back. He was at the centre of the most controversial incident in the game, when he was dispossessed by Cyril Dessers, but VAR ruled out Kimaru's goal. Lagerbielke is hoping to win his second cap for his country after being called up by Sweden for their Euro 2022 qualifiers in Tallinn against Estonia and in Stockholm against Austria. And he's delighted with the way his move has gone so far. Lagerbielke said, "We had two tough results going into the derby against Rangers. So, it was a very important win, and there was a lot of emotion after the game. It was nice to keep Ibrox quiet. It was an awesome experience. I had been given a little warning about what it would be like, but it was kind of cooler than I thought. It was very important that we won. To be called up for Sweden was a dream come true for me. It's been so intense since I moved, and this is the latest chapter. I've just got to go with the flow. And, of course, we also have the Champions League to look forward to. The draw was a bit surreal. I had to pinch myself that I was sitting at Celtic Park watching the Champions League draw. In fact, it's probably the only time I've been nervous so far at Celtic. But it will be fun to play in the Champions League. We play against three good teams with fantastic stadiums and fans. There will be 6 top matches with an incredible setting for them all. It's been great at Celtic so far. The guys in the team and the management team have been very welcoming, and it's nice to be able to start playing straight away. It has been very educational. I even viewed Carl Starfelt's old flat in Glasgow, but it was too nice for me. But I did talk to him in the camp this week, and it was nice to share his experiences. We hadn't actually met before the gathering here, so it was fun to talk. And the article was by Mark Walker. From the Herald Scotland, Thursday the 7th of September, from the Voices section, Opinion. Hooray for HUMZA YOUSAF for backing the 4-day week, by Neil Mackay, writer at large. Absolute goggle-eyed insanity seems the order of the day in Scotland. Apparently, regulating landlords is now equivalent to a pogrom by HUMZA YOUSAF. Yep, pogrom, where Jewish victims of ethnic cleansing in Germany, Russia and Eastern Europe were beaten and murdered. Scottish Tory MSPs Pam Gosell and Ros McCall were pictured at a protest against short-term legislation outside Holyrood this week, where one placard read, "Are you a pogrom parliament?" Answer, no, but are you nuts? Incidentally, Ms Gosell has shares in a property letting agency. Still, given Marxist, zealot, groomer, quisling, Yoon, Nazi, traitor, scum, et al. Are now just dandy as part of our political lexicon, why not throw in the Holocaust too? It was only a matter of time. One imagines we'll eventually drop all niceties and in future debates refer to each other as murderers and paedophiles. If that's the level of crazy over regulating holiday homes, may the gods pity us when it comes to the reaction to trialling a 4-day week in Scotland. What could the insults be? Terrorists, maybe? That's obviously demented, but then pogrom hardly fits regulated to the oversight of landlords. Little wonder Mr YOUSAF barely mentions the 4-day week scheme. It wasn't in his address to Parliament earlier this week, but it is in his legislative programme. If the Scottish Government invented a cure for cancer, there will be outraged claims it was putting the Grim Reaper in jeopardy. However, if we calm the dram and have a proper old think, remember that, about a 4-day week, it seems rather decent, if done correctly, clearly as an opt-in, not a matter of compulsion. First, things change, society moves on. Once upon a time, most of us were serfs. Our liege lord would ride into our village, give us a damn good thrashing for not picking turnips fast enough, kidnap our children and burn the rest of our family, just for the crack. After centuries of living as human scarecrows in fields and pigsties, we eventually shifted from serfdom to earning some money for our labour. We obstreperous peasants would still be swiftly executed, though, if we asked for a few groats more to feed our now non-kidnapped children. Then we made it into factories. We earned slightly more, but were either worked to death or mangled in spinning jennies. Average working times in Victorian Britain were up 14 to 16 hours daily. Finally, the weekend was invented. Or rather, fought for by that old-fashioned thing, organised labour. Our ancestors mostly still lived in squalor, but at least they got a lie-in come Sunday. The key to all this? The rich get richer by exploiting the poor, and the poor have to fight like hell for the tiniest improvement to living and working conditions. Which brings us to the 4-day week, reducing work to around 32 hours with no loss of pay. The Scottish Government pilot will involve civil servants and start by the end of the year. Currently, you can't be made to work above 48 hours a week. That's a lot of non-you time. A lot of hours away from your family. Is change due? Shouldn't society evolve in the 21st century? Let's chow down on some of those rare, tasty treats called facts. Recently, the largest trial of the 4-day week in Britain released its results. The findings are interesting and sobering. It was held over 6 months, involving 61 organisations and businesses, and 2,900 staff. Industries involved included financial services, animation, brewing, chippies, consultancies, housing, IT, skincare, recruitment, hospitality, marketing, healthcare, a flotilla of sectors. At the end, 56 of the firms, that's 92%, decided to continue with the scheme, with 18 making a permanent shift. Klaxon, productivity wasn't harmed. Cambridge University reported that, crucially, revenue barely changed during the trial period, even increasing marginally by 1.4% on average. Here are more findings from Cambridge social scientists, those forgotten rarities once respected as experts. 71% of employees reported lower burnout levels. 39% were less stressed. Sick days were reduced by 65%. 57% fewer staff quit. Employees cope better with care responsibilities for children, elderly parents and sick partners. Mental and physical health improved. Staff stopped killing time. Before the trial, many questioned whether we would see an increase in productivity to offset the reduction in working time. But this is exactly what we found, said sociologist Professor Brendan Burchell, who read the Cambridge research. Whisper it. Perhaps the well-being economy ain't so bad, eh? If it doesn't harm business and it makes workers happier, what's the problem? One doesn't want to fall back in that old rhetorical trick, argument from authority. Well, okay, I do. But let's turn to Bertrand Russell, mathematician, philosopher, global polymath and genius, so hardly someone dedicated to doing naff all. He said, the road to happiness and prosperity lies in the diminution of labour. Work is important, vital for the human creature. It brings dignity, self-respect, the means to improve our lives and our children's lives, but we should work to live, not live to work, as we do now. How many of your friends and family are mere ghosts, reduced as social shadows, sucked dry by a corporate world which cares not one damn for you once you leave, die or get made redundant? Work should bend to the will of the people. The people should not bend to the will of corporations. Our lives are damn short, maybe 80 years if you're lucky. Most of that time should be spent with the people we love. Most of that time should be spent on that most special of projects, enjoying ourselves. Yes, we need to work, not just for self-esteem, but for the money we require to live happy lives in our free time with those who matter to us. But no, we do not need to be cogs in a machine, like Charlie Chaplin in modern times, a beast crucified by industry and commerce. I'll give the closing word to Kurt Vonnegut, perhaps the greatest novelist of the 20th century and, as a man who seldom stopped writing, evidently not someone you could characterise as lazy. We are here on earth to fart around, and don't let anybody tell you any different. Amen. And that was an opinion piece by Neil Mackay.
Herald Scotland recorded on Thursday 7th of September 2023. Arts and Entertainments. Bloody Scotland finalists revealed for McIlvanney Prize by Gabriel Mackay. The final 4 shortlisted novels have been announced for the McIlvanney Prize 2023. Previously known as the Bloody Scotland Prize for Scottish Crime Writing, the award was set up by Scottish crime writers and first awarded in 2012. From a previous long list of 12, the nominees have been trimmed down to 4. In previous years, the long list was determined by a panel of readers. This year, the reader scores were referred to an academy led by crime reviewer Ayo Onatade, Waterstone's category manager for crime fiction Gabby Lee, and journalist and author Craig Sisterson. The books nominated are Squeaky Clean by Callum McSorley, The Second Murderer by Denise Mina, Robbie Morrison's Cast a Cold Eye, and The Devil's Playground by Craig Russell. The overall winner will be decided by a panel of 4 judges: BBC Scotland presenter Brian Burnett, former editor of the Sunday Times Scotland Jason Allardyce, and category manager for Waterstones Angie Crawford. The list features 2 previous winners, brackets Craig Russell and Denise Mina, close brackets, a previous winner of the Bloody Scotland Debut Prize, brackets Robbie Morrison, close brackets, and debut author, brackets Callum McSorley, close brackets. The finalists, along with the authors shortlisted for the Bloody Scotland Debut Prize, will lead a torchlit procession from Stirling Castle to the Albert Halls on Friday, 15 September, where the winners of both prizes will be revealed and interviewed on stage by BBC Radio Scotland's Janice Forsyth. By Gabriel Mackay. Herald Scotland recorded on Thursday, 7th of September 2023. Arts and Entertainments. Tony Blackburn on dealing with depression, divorce, and John Peel. By Brian Beacom, senior features writer. Tony Blackburn offers a statement that sounds as discordant as a blunt needle hitting a shiny new record. Veteran DJ, one of the most popular figures in UK entertainment, admits to being a natural loner. I've always kept away largely from showbiz, he admits. I don't have that many friends overall, to be honest with you. I'm more involved in family life and putting my shows together, and at nights I like watching Coronation Street. This rather surprising and ironic life, given he's so much in the public eye, isn't the result of an ageing man retreating into the dark of his telly room. No, I've always been a bit of a loner. When I was younger, I'd be on my own a lot, listening to music. That's who I am. But who really is Tony Blackburn? No one can deny that the DJ had a totally pop-tastic career since opening the mic to Radio 1 in 1967. He's a DJ who has enjoyed the same level of adulation as those whose records he played. Right now he's touring the UK, fronting an evening of 1960s classics performed live. He continues to front shows in BBC Radio 2, as well as local and digital stations. He even won I'm a Celebrity back in 2002. But how has the small-framed quiet man with the big broadcasting voice managed to survive in the business when he himself declares, "I'm not show busy at all"? Is Tony Blackburn the human equivalent of one of those hallmark Top of the Pops albums of the 1960s, featuring a dolly bird on the cover, which sort of hit the mark with pop music fans but didn't stand up to too much close listening? Or is he more Island Records or Motown focused, with a great USP and a fantastic game plan? Consider Blackburn's performance style. Although brought up in Poole in Dorset, he began his radio career on pirate ships a couple of miles along the Thames estuary. Yet he sounds transatlantic, and he's a DJ so synonymous with cheesy puns and irrepressible tone that Harry Enfield and Paul Whitehouse couldn't help but see his pastiche value. However, despite or because of his style, Tony Blackburn has managed not only to be voted Britain's top disc jockey and collect several Radio Academy Awards, but to remain relevant over almost 7 decades. How does he think he's managed to remain in the groove? It surprises me as much as it does you, he says, grinning, of 59 years of dropping needles onto records. I think I've been very lucky, but I think it's also because I've been very enthusiastic about radio, from the pirate radio days of the 1960s onto Radio 1 and Radio 2. And the shows I've done are very different from the iconic sounds of the 60s in which I took over from Brian Matthew, and then the Golden Hour. And I do a local network radio show from 2 to 6 p.m. Plus I do a soul show for Radio London, which I record here at home. Gosh, you're more in demand than mortgage advice at the moment, Tony. But we've seen so many radio stars crash and burn. How have you managed, brackets, for the most part, see you later, close brackets, to remain in radio space? He cites his former manager as part of the reason. When Blackburn was in Radio Caroline, the Boy Wonder aroused the attention of elite showbiz manager Harold Davison. Harold first asked me to join him and moved to the BBC, but I told him I was really happy at sea with Radio Luxembourg. Then when the government brought in the legislation to block the pirates, Harold said, "Sign to me and work for the BBC and I'll make you their biggest disc jockey in 2 months." Well, the reality was it only took 4 weeks. Davison, however, didn't allow success to send the Blackburn head spinning. Harold was like a second father to me, and he taught me the rules for survival. He said, "Be nice to people, keep your feet in the ground, don't get carried away with the publicity you'll get," and I try not to. I also learned a lot from, brackets, the late DJ and TV star, close brackets, Simon D. We had been in the pirate ships together, and Simon was a nice guy, but he lost the plot a little. More than a little, hubris, ego, and E-type flash arrogance saw his radio and TV career implode. I think he suffered because his manager told him he was a superstar, says Blackburn. That's a generous statement, but is it an indicator that if you say nice things about people, the longer you last? Over the years, the broadcaster certainly hasn't thrown an angry invective around, although he did find himself suspended from the BBC during the 1973 miners' strike when he upset half the nation by saying the pit workers should get back to work. Brackets, he later apologised and never made that mistake again, close brackets. But what of Blackburn's belief that he's not really of the showbuzz world? Surely he must have craved access given he was in a band, brackets, Tony Blackburn and the Rovers, close brackets, for 3 years on leaving boarding school and initially set out to become a pop star himself. Blackburn doesn't see any contradiction here. However, he became more animated when asked if his on-air emotional breakdown in 1976, his marriage collapsed and he played breakup records continually, brackets, e.g. Chicago's If You Leave Me Now, close brackets, helped seal his special relationship with fans. "No, I shouldn't have done that," he says emphatically, "but I had no one around to tell me not to. Harold had left for America by this time. He wanted me to go with him, but I didn't want to leave my son." What the nation didn't know was that both he and actress wife Tessa Wyatt had been having affairs with the partners of their best friends. Regardless, it's fascinating that Blackburn sort of blames the lack of advice for his poor decision-making. Brackets, although his excuse for Simon D's behaviour, close brackets. He repeats this defence in his autobiography, in which he admitted he slept with hundreds of women after his divorce, hanging around wine bars wearing shiny medallions and lots of chest hair. Yes, it was a bit crass. But his reason for the blunder was he wasn't told not to talk about his sexual conquests. As part of Tony Blackburn's ongoing popularity, down to the fact the public love this man-child who hasn't quite grown up, he laughs as he admits that after his divorce he lived in tinned lentil soup, ambrosia rice and processed peas. Yes, he is a vegetarian, but again it's a bit schoolboy. He doesn't disagree. Nor does he disagree with the theory, he simply doesn't like to fall out with people. Yet Radio 1 in the 1960s and 1970s was a bed of giant egos. Surely he must have scratched someone's record. He thinks and smiles. The only person who didn't really like me was John Peel, brackets, who labelled his BBC colleague the devil, close brackets, for some reason. I never found out why. Peel, with his pirate outlook insouciance, didn't take to Tony's pop-tasticness at all. Although one day he said to me, "You've done so much for soul music in this country," and I said to him, "Thanks, but will you say that out loud in air?" And he grinned and said, "Oh no." Yet Blackburn could be a little devilish. When John was featured on This Is Your Life, I appeared through the door and I could see the horror in his face. What emerges is that Tony Blackburn has less of an edge than an LP record. "I had a lovely upbringing," he once said of his nice middle-class childhood, with his nurse mum and GP dad. "My parents instilled strong moral values in me. They weren't strict and I never wanted to rebel, because I had nothing to rebel against. Yet there's a tough survivor instinct that can't be ignored. In the early 1980s, Blackburn was dropped by the BBC from breakfast slots to afternoons, all the way down to weekends, finding himself fronting Junior Choice. The man who'd found and pushed Diana Ross's sublime I'm Still Waiting to a #1 chart hit, found himself ignominiously playing Puff the Magic Dragon. Depression developed, he admitted he felt suicidal, but he dragged himself back into the game by marching along the road to Radio London, where he broadcast a soul show. It was a huge success and a stream of offers followed. Of course, Tony Blackburn continued to divide the listening public just by being Tony Blackburn. Again, hints of immaturity emerged, and certainly cringiness, with his attempts at being a little risque, talking a lot about 12-inchers. At times he came across as a little vainglorious. He'd go on stage and say, "I'll stand here for a minute and let you admire me. I wish I was out there with you, enjoying me." Of course, he was having a laugh, and the world knew he was really happy about meeting the new love of his life, Debbie, a theatrical agent, because he told them. Indeed, into the noughties, life and career played out smoothly, the only little sign of a critical headline emerging in 2004, when working with a classic gold station, the DJ insisted on playing Cliff Richard's records and was suspended. To be fair to the station, this was pretty heinous. In 2010, Blackburn finally achieved a move on to Radio 2. "I was 37 when I left Radio 1, and 2 seemed a natural progression," he said at the time, "so it's only taken 30 years. Tony Blackburn built on his national icon status, but in 2016 his on-air cheeriness crashed. In the wake of the Jimmy Savile scandal, several showbiz innocents faced unfounded, false accusations, such as Paul Gambaccini and Sir Cliff Richard. Blackburn was sacked by the BBC. I only found out when I went in to make a programme. The door commissioner said to me, "Sorry, you're leaving." The corporation said contents of documents from the early 1970s were in conflict with evidence Blackburn gave to Dame Janet Smith's inquiry into Jimmy Savile's sex abuse at the BBC. It was nonsense. Tony Blackburn denied ever being interviewed about an alleged incident in the 1970s. The BBC later apologised and the presenter was welcomed back to front shows such as Sounds of the 60s. How did all this impact upon his head? Blackburn swerves the question. Perhaps longevity in the broadcasting business depends upon knowing when not to speak. Let's try another tricky question, Tony. How does he feel to be working in an industry that no longer draws from radio experience, where presenters are parachuted in from television, brackets, and even if they lose 1 million listeners, the BBC will keep them on, close brackets? Yes, it has changed a lot, he said, of the recruitment strategy. It's not my way of doing it. And personally, I prefer the art of radio, selecting and playing the records. Some people can do both, of course. Noel Edmonds was a great example. It's a safe answer, but he got his point across. Let's go back to his success story. Does he feel that being forever young has helped him hang on so long? He comes across as ageless. Well, if you look at photographs of me in 1964, you won't think that's the case, he says, laughing, but he retains a boyishness. Well, I don't like being 80, but I agree that mentally I'm not. His voice becomes dark. Although I caught sepsis and pneumonia recently and was rushed to hospital and was there for 2 months, with infected blood which went into my heart. I didn't realise how unwell I was until I looked up from my bed and all my family were around me. His specialist has given him the all clear. He admits that he's touring the Sounds of the 60s shows just once a week now, but loves the chance to talk to audiences about his life in showbiz, even though he's not show busy. But looking back, what would he have done differently? Some radio fans have wished they could have his broadcast jingle sidekick Arnold the dog put down. They've considered his puns to be a proven health risk. I don't regret much, he says in an upbeat voice. I guess I regret divorce, but then I had my lovely second wife and daughter. What about Chop Chop, that truly awful single you released in 1971? Yes, people didn't seem to like that much. And I've made 29 singles and 2 albums, and none of them sold very well. He laughs hard. Here's a big regret, I couldn't get the Radio 1 DJs to play my records. So what's the secret of Tony Blackburn's achieving the status of radio legend? It's down to the fact people really like Tony Blackburn, even if his personality suggests a compilation album of so many different traits. Chat reveals he's empathetic, a good listener, a feeling underlined by a quote he once gave. I lived by myself and I experienced loneliness. I think it's quite a good thing to have had that, because then you can feel the way other people feel. There's no doubt he's an immensely sensitive character, despite the big cheery transatlantic delivery. He offers a final thought. I'm really about going into a studio and playing records and talking nonsense. Tony Blackburn's Sounds of the 60s live shows head to Edinburghshire Hall and Glasgow King's Theatre this month. Ticketmaster.co.uk. Radio 1 stars of the 1960s and 1970s, Noel Edmonds, straddled radio and television effortlessly with shows such as Deal or No Deal and amassed an £80 million fortune. But his career faced a major setback when a contestant in his show, The Late Late Breakfast, died after a bungee stunt went wrong. John Peel, the former pirate radio DJ, developed a career playing eclectic, offbeat music, which he knew would offer him a niche position. Peel died in 2004, aged 65. Simon Bates. At his peak, Bates pulled in 11 million listeners to Radio 1. The 76-year-old then moved on to a series of commercial stations, now appearing on Boom Radio. Ed Stewart, an early success at Radio 1, Stu Pop moved to Radio 2 and became the frontman of Junior Choice. He died aged 76 in 2016 after suffering a stroke. Kenny Everett joined Radio 1 in 1967, but the impish unpredictability of Everett saw him exit Broadcasting House and moved to television, where he became a national treasure. He died from age-related illness in 1995. Stuart Henry, the Scot, a one-time actor, was a Radio 1 star in the late 1960s before moving to Radio Luxembourg. However, his battle with MS was lost in 1995. Johnny Walker, the former pirate broadcaster, joined Radio 1 in 1969 and today still broadcasts his Sounds of the 70s show on Radio 2. The 78-year-old has survived a battle with cancer. Alan Freeman. Fluff Freeman became the voice of Pick of the Pops, the Australian managing to enthrall a nation of excited teenagers each Sunday. He died aged 76 in 2006. Dave Lee Travis. Travis became a massive Radio 1 star in the 70s before moving on to commercial radio with Magic FM. A conviction for a sexual offence meant his contract was not renewed. Jimmy Savile died in 2011, went straight to hell. By Brian Beacom.
From the Herald Scotland, Friday the 8th of September, from the sports section, exclusive. Richard Gough recalls Scotland glory goals against Cyprus and England. This article is an exclusive by Graham McGarry. These days, matches with 8, 9 or 10 minutes of stoppage time, or more, are commonplace, but for a certain vintage of Scot, there was once a sole reference point for any game that went beyond the usual 2 or 3 minutes of discretionary time. Richard Gough's wondrous headed goal against Cyprus. The grainy, sun-soaked images beamed back to living rooms in the late afternoon. School kids rushing through the door just in time to see his flame-red hair appear through the static. The net bulging in what seemed like the 150th minute of a gruelling encounter. Scotland, improbably, having 1 foot in the World Cup. It may have been way back in 1989 that Gough scored that famous header for his country, but, along with his goal against England in the 1985 Roos Cup win, it is the one that people still approach him to talk about all these years on. So, with Scotland taking on Cyprus on the Sunshine Island and England at Hampden over the next few days, it seems an opportune time not only to do the same and get his recollections of these iconic moments, but to also get his insight into the challenge that lies ahead for Steve Clarke and his men. First of all, in Larnaca this evening. These games are never straightforward, Goff said. Our group for Italia 90 also had France and Yugoslavia in it, and Yugoslavia had a really good team. France drew against Cyprus over there. They drew 1-1, and we knew if we bettered that result we had a good chance, because Yugoslavia were by far the best team. I remember it was really nice weather. The ground was really hard and bouncy. It was difficult conditions. We all had the rubber studs on. We soon figured out why they managed to draw with France. They were actually a good team as well. They had some good players. We went 1-0 up. Maurice Johnson scored a great goal. Then they equalised, and not long into the second half they went ahead. We knew that if we lost that game we wouldn't have gone to the World Cup. So, luckily enough, wee Maurice laid one back to me and my shot took a wicked deflection to take the goalie out, and somehow it ended up in the net. At 2-2 we were both pushing for the winner, so it got really end to end. We got a free kick in the 97th minute of the game. Big Roy Aitken pinged the ball across, and I scored one of the best headers that I ever scored in my career. It was a really good header. The keeper had no chance. It was really unusual for that amount of time to be added on in those days, but, thankfully, it was on that occasion. It's funny, because people always come to me and talk about it. They always mention that they got away from school early to see that game, and they saw that goal, but they forget I actually scored the equaliser as well. I scored a few good headers in my career, but in terms of how important that was for the country, that one was massive. If I'd even drawn that game, I don't think we would have made the World Cup, so it was so important. We went on to beat France, and the rest is history. That was a great achievement given we were up against them and a great Yugoslavia team. One man who didn't appear to be quite as impressed with Goff's feat though, was the man whose job it was quite possibly saved by it, with the Scotland manager of the time being understated in his remarks to the sweltering press pack after the match finally ended. I always remember Andy Roxburgh after the game telling the media that Roy had put a great ball over and Goffey had just managed to get the end of it, he said. I thought, there was a bit more to it than that, Andy. They were a good team, with a lot of players playing for the big Greek clubs back then. We had myself, Dave Neary and Alec McLeish at the back, so it tells you something when they gave us a hard time. We were expected to win, but away from home, when you go to these places, it is never easy. We have played Cyprus on several occasions since that day, and they have never been easy games, so Steve Clarke will know the task that lies ahead. Beyond that crucial World Cup qualifier lies a friendly match, a fixture that normally, and particularly off the back of an energy-sapping game in such humid conditions, would be a chance for Clarke to utilise his squad. But this is no normal friendly, with the old enemy coming to Glasgow to mark the 150th anniversary of the formation of the Scottish FA. As Goff says, there is never a friendly against England. Certainly, in his days as a player and the annual home internationals, there was a feeling that familiarity with their foe bred a level of contempt, which is why Goff's winner in the Roos Cup match means so much to him this day. I must have played about 6 or 7 games against them in the time of the home internationals, he said. At that time there was a great rivalry. We had the best English players at Ibrox later on, of course, but there was also the fact that the best Scottish players played in England, which is how it is now as well. So there was a huge rivalry. I remember in that game Trevor Francis and Mark Hateley were up front for England, and Big Alex had a great game. He had Big Hateley in his pocket. It was a tight game. I think it was Graham Souness took a free kick to me, I gave it to Gordon Strachan, and then he rolled it out to Jimmy Bett. I just continued my run like I used to do, got in the box at the far post, and Jimmy has floated the ball right onto my head. I got above Kenny Sansom, all 5'5" of him. There's a great picture of that with Big Butch standing in the middle of marking Stevie Archibald. I met it with a perfect header. It just floated beautifully above Peter Shilton, who was the best goalkeeper in Britain at that time. It's another goal that people come up to me and talk about. It's that and the goal against Cyprus. There aren't many Scots who have scored a winning goal against England, so I'm very proud of that one. Unlike Roxburgh, the national team manager at that particular time was a little more forthcoming in his praise for his match winner. I always remember after the England game, Jockstein came to see me with the Rouse Cup, which is full of champagne, he said. He said, "You deserve this, son." But I said to him, "No thanks, Mr. Steen, I don't drink champagne." He looked at me and he said, "Drink it, son, never refuse champagne, because champagne means success." That's what he said to me. And you know what? I never stopped drinking it after that. But I suppose that means I had a lot of success. He was old school, and that always stuck with me in my head. I was only 22 or 23 at that time, but what a memory to have. For the Tartan Army, it is unlikely that the memory of either Goth's famous headers will fade away anytime soon, and it is even less likely they would ever give the scorer himself the opportunity to forget them either. It is the fact that people remember these goals that makes them so special, he said. People send me links to them. I watched the highlights of the Cyprus game about 3 weeks ago, and after someone sent me it. It's great to look back on these days. I've actually got some good pictures of the Cyprus goal. I got a good jump on it. Those 2 goals, I timed them perfectly. It's like when a golfer hits a perfect golf shot, you just catch it flush in the forehead and the ball is going exactly where you want it to go. That could be unusual at the time, in fairness. I look back on those goals as 2 of the real highlights of my career, and it is just absolutely brilliant to see Scotland back at that level again. And that piece was an exclusive by Graham McGarry. From the Herald Scotland, Monday the 11th of September, from the news section. Former Scottish schoolboy arrested on suspicion of spying for China. By Kathleen Nutt, political correspondent. A former private schoolboy from Edinburgh is today being reported as a Tory parliamentary researcher arrested on suspicion of spying for China. The man, who is in his late 20s, was employed by a senior Conservative MP. He is reportedly the son of a GP and grew up in a wealthy suburb of the capital where he attended George Watson's College before attending university in Scotland. When he was arrested in March, a handful of ministers were informed, but details of the alleged security breach were not made public until this weekend, prompting outrage from MPs who were left in the dark. The Times, which broke the story, has been unable to contact the suspect for comment. Several MPs have been outspoken in their condemnation of China's human rights record and have been sanctioned by Beijing. They fear that they are targets for the Chinese security services. The MPs were so concerned by the researcher's arrest that they were preparing to use parliamentary privilege to name him as a suspect in the Commons this week. Sir Ian Duncan Smith, the former Tory leader who has been sanctioned by China, told The Times, "It's a remarkably dangerous situation. This is a guy who allegedly spies on behalf of the Chinese government in a place where decisions are made and sensitive information is transferred." Another Tory MP, who has been sanctioned by China, told the paper, "I'm in a complete state of shock. We weren't told about this. We haven't been given any support. All sanctioned MPs should have been told. How many more people are there in Parliament who might be targeting us?" A third sanctioned Tory MP said, "We didn't know anything until we read it in the paper," the Sunday Times. "I feel incredibly let down." China has labelled the arrest a political farce and malicious slander. The claim that China is suspected of stealing British intelligence is completely fabricated and nothing but malicious slander, the Chinese embassy in London said in a statement published late on Sunday. "We firmly oppose it and urge relevant parties in the UK to stop their anti-China political manipulation and stop putting on such self-staged political farce." The case is likely to raise serious questions about security. The researcher was vetted as a parliamentary pass holder, but did not have security clearance. The Times reported that it understood the material exchange was not necessarily classified or top secret. However, a security source said that the information did not need to be top secret to be highly sensitive and valuable to China. It's about networks and about influence. What do people in Parliament think? Which other people can be spoken to? The man became active on Westminster's social scene and used a dating website, making several attempts last year to arrange a date with a political journalist. Noah Hoffman of The Sun wrote on X that she came extremely close to going on a date with an alleged Chinese spy. We matched on Hinge last year and kept meaning to go for drinks, but someone always ended up cancelling last minute, she said. On one occasion, when they were due to meet, he had cancelled because he had COVID-19. Last year, the alleged work of Christine Lee, an alleged agent for the Communist Party, prompted MI5 to release a rare interference alert, even though she is not believed to have accessed top-secret material. She denies any wrongdoing and is understood to be suing MI5. Matt Dukes, the Met's Assistant Commissioner in charge of counter-terrorism, said earlier this year that investigations linked to threats from foreign states have quadrupled in the last 2 years. The National Security Act, which became law and replaced the Official Secrets Act this summer, contains new powers to make it easier to prosecute the passing of information to hostile states. It does not apply in this case. The researcher from Edinburgh was arrested at the same time as a second man in his 30s. Both have been released on police bail until October. Tory MP Caroline Notes called for a review of the passes. She told Times Radio, "We need them to be looking at what passes have been issued and making sure that those who shouldn't have them don't." And that report was by Kathleen Nutt. From the Herald Scotland, Monday the 11th of September, from the sports section, Novak Djokovic will keep going after US Open win. This article is unattributed. Novak Djokovic has bad news for Carlos Alcaraz, Daniil Medvedev, and all the other Grand Slam hopefuls. "I'm going to keep going." Djokovic secured a record 24th Grand Slam title when he beat Medvedev in 3 grueling sets to win the US Open. The 36-year-old capped another dominant year, during which he won the Australian and French Opens and was runner-up to Alcaraz at Wimbledon, by becoming the oldest champion at Flushing medals in the Open era. Even Medvedev, whose challenge ended after he lost a marathon 104-minute second set, asked, "What are you still doing here? I mean, come on." But Djokovic insisted, "I'm going to keep going. You know, I feel good in my own body. I still feel I've got the support of my environment, of my team, of my family." The Grand Slams, I have said it in the last few years, have always been the highest goal, and the priority of mine is the whole season. I don't play as much in terms of other tournaments, so I try to prioritise my preparation so that I can peak in slams. These are the moments and these are the kind of emotions that I motivate myself with every single day when I'm not playing a tournament. Yeah, occasionally I ask myself, why do I need this still at this stage? After all I have done, you know? How long do I want to keep going? I do have these questions in my head, of course. But knowing that I play at such a high level still, and I win the biggest tournaments in this sport, I don't want to leave this sport. If I'm still at the top, you know, if I'm still playing the way I'm playing. An Medvedev double fault and a blistering backhand winner down the line gave Djokovic the early break point, which he converted to love to subsequently take the first set in a relatively speedy 48 minutes. But Medvedev, returning from about a quarter of a mile behind the baseline, made Djokovic toil in the second set, and it began to show, with the favourite showing signs of fatigue. After an hour and 3/4, he produced his first break point of the match, but Djokovic, with an obvious change of game plan and a bid to shorten the points, expertly snuffed it out with a big serve and an immaculate volley. Medvedev had set point in the Djokovic serve, but another volley at the net dealt with that, and, when the tiebreak slipped away from the 27-year-old, the match soon followed as Djokovic moved level with Margaret Court's record of major titles. "The second set was the best set I played and I didn't win it," said Russian third seed Medvedev. So that's why it's normal that the match went that way, because the first and third he was kind of better. The second, if I would win it, maybe it could have been a different game. Yeah, that's how life is and how tennis is. So I'm going to try to be better next time. And that article is unattributed.
This is from the Herald Scotland on Monday the 11th of September 2023. From Voices section. Scotland economy woe stems from Conservatives. Report by Ian McConnell. HUMZA YOUSAF, Anis Sarwar and Douglas Ross seem to have been almost falling over themselves to talk about the Scottish economy and business recently. The First Minister appeared at pains to try to portray himself as willing to listen to and support business as he unveiled his programme for government last week. Among measures announced was funding for startups and scale-ups. He has already, since becoming First Minister in the spring, been promoting his New Deal for Business pledge. Anis Sarwar, for his part, at the end of last month, billed Scottish Labour as unashamedly a pro-business and pro-growth party, as he insisted he could become the next First Minister in 2026. The Scottish Labour leader set out an economic growth strategy focused on green energy, finance and technology. Scottish Conservatives leader Douglas Ross, meanwhile, made a big deal of launching his party's Grasping the Thistle report on the economy late last month. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, this did not mention what has been a flagship policy of his party for years now: Brexit. The thoughts of the UK in a Changing Europe UKICE think tank on Brexit, in a report published last week with full fact, were well worth reading up on. You get the impression that many in Mr Ross's party will not, however, be rushing to do so. The UKICE report formed the basis of my column in the Herald on Wednesday. The think tank's report was strikingly different from Mr Ross's implied message. When pressed by the National on why he had not mentioned the UK's exit from the European Union in his party's Grasping the Thistle report, that Brexit is somehow in the past, he seemed to imply this by talking about how, when asked about Brexit, he was instead looking to the future. Jonathan Portes, a senior fellow of the Economic and Social Research Council-funded UKICE initiative based at King's College London, said, "Brexit is undoubtedly a drag on growth. It's hard to see major improvements to the UK's growth trajectory resulting from relatively minor improvements to the current trading arrangements. The next government will have to decide whether that is all that is politically feasible, or whether, at least over the medium term, the potential economic benefits of a more ambitious renegotiation of the UK's economic relationship with the EU outweigh the obvious political risks." UKICE Director Anand Menon noted Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer had ruled out a fundamental reassessment of the relationship in the form of a bid to join either the customs union or single market, let alone reapply to the EU. He observed, "There is little appetite on the part of the current UK government to build on the relationship negotiated by Boris Johnson." And Mr Menon declared, "Even were Labour to be successful in reaching, for instance, a veterinary agreement with the EU, these kinds of measure will make little difference to the overall economic impact of Brexit. Consequently, that impact will continue to be felt, exacerbating the problems in generating growth." Both the Conservatives and Labour in Scotland would seem likely to face continuing challenges over the pro-Brexit stances of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir, who would do well to read the UKICE report and the myriad other pieces of research showing the impact on the UK of leaving the EU. In the meantime, Mr YOUSAF is certainly not without his troubles when it comes to business, even if his opposition to Brexit makes perfect sense from an economic perspective, and he has other positives on which to draw, such as Scotland's very strong inward investment track record. A survey published on August the 30th by the Fraser of Allender Institute in conjunction with law firm Addleshaw Goddard showed only 9% of firms agreed or strongly agreed that the Scottish Government understands the business environment in Scotland, compared with 64% of businesses that disagreed or strongly disagreed. This highlights the headwinds Mr YOUSAF faces as he attempts to persuade businesses he is giving them a new deal. Perceptions can develop a life of their own, even if they are sometimes a bit detached from reality, and can become entrenched. All the while, as party leaders in Scotland attempt to promote themselves as good for business and the economy, it is important not to become too parochial. We must bear in mind that the main levers when it comes to the overall state of the economy in Scotland remain at Westminster, and the extent of the cacophony around devolved policies will not change that. You get the impression that devolution in Scotland and the warring within Scotland's political goldfish bowl is preventing some people at least from recognising that much of the blame for the troubles of businesses and households north of the border lies firmly with Westminster. The Conservatives' track record since 2010 is abysmal and would suggest they do not understand much at all about the business environment or the economy. That report was by Ian McConnell.
From the Herald Scotland, Monday the 11th of September. From the business section, Graham Roy, statistics must be treated with caution. Dennis Healy, Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Callaghan era, famously claimed that had he been given more accurate economic data, the UK would not have needed a bailout from the IMF in 1976. Whether this is true remains one of the quirky unknowns of UK economic history. Subsequent data have indeed confirmed that the figures used by the Treasury overstated the scale of fiscal crisis facing the then Labour government. But by any objective assessment, the weakness of the UK's balance of payments, pressures in sterling and a ballooning budget deficit still meant that some form of hard landing was inevitable. Changing narratives and revisions to economic statistics have, once again, hit the headlines. Last week, the Office for National Statistics published revised estimates for the UK economy. These increased the size of the UK economy by around 2% to the end of 2021. As a result, two key facts that we've become accustomed to over the last couple of years have been turned on their head. Firstly, the ONS's revisions now suggest that by the end of 2021, the UK economy had already returned to be above pre-pandemic levels, to the tune of plus 0.6% instead of minus 1.2% as previously estimated. Secondly, the UK is no longer the worst performing economy in the G7. This latter narrative had been used to criticise the health of the UK economy and the direction of economic policy. What has caused such revisions? Measuring the health of our economy is not an exact science. It is simply not possible to accurately assess every bit of economic activity, particularly with much urgency. In 2021, the UK economy was valued at nearly £2.3 trillion, or 2.3 million. That's a lot of activity to measure. Rather than try and track every element of that scale, statisticians rely upon samples of firms and day-to-day economic activities that they hope are representative of the wider economy. But as more information becomes available over time, these initial estimates will change as more data is factored in. On top of this, there are basic challenges in defining what is growth. For some sectors, such as manufacturing, the concept is relatively straightforward. There, growth is a mixture of the quantity and the value of what is being produced. If a distillery produces and sells more high-quality whisky, GDP grows. But how best to measure growth in education or the fire service? Or how to measure the improvement in GDP from the latest iPhone model or a new social media app? Changes to the methodologies, or existing methodologies, not accurately picking up what is going on in the real economy, can also therefore lead to estimates of growth in the economy being revised. The fault, if there is one, doesn't all lie with statisticians. As economists and commentators, we don't help ourselves with how we communicate new data. We present every GDP update as definitive, despite knowing full well the margins of error. These errors are are that much larger at turning points or times of crisis in the economy. This is why we need to be cautious in reading too much, just yet, into last month's negative 0.3% growth figures for Scotland for the 3 months of April to June. Of course, a shrinking economy is a concern, but longer term trends are more valuable. Here, the picture remains mixed. The recession forecast this time last year has, so far, not materialised. But, at the Fiscal Commission, we've stressed that this year and next are still likely to see relatively fragile growth, at best, as the cost of living crisis acts as a drag on economic activity. Nothing we're seeing in the estimates alters that view. What does this mean for policymakers? In short, rather than focusing on short-term movements and revisions to statistics like GDP, attention is better directed at tracking the underlying health of our business base, our labour market and productivity. Back in 2000, the then Scottish Executive set an objective of establishing a dynamic competitiveness in Scottish enterprises. With nearly 25 years of experience, asking ourselves some honest questions about our track record on improving the dynamism and size of our business base is likely to provide much more revealing insights on the strength of our economy. And, on those measures, there is significant progress still required. That piece was by Graham Roy, who is a Professor of Economics at the University of Glasgow's Adam Smith Business School.
The Herald on the 12th of September and the news section. MSPs highlight unacceptable waits to connect to grid by Jodie Harrison. MSPs have called for action to tackle unacceptable waits when connecting to electricity projects to the national grid, with a Holyrood committee saying it can take upwards of a decade. Members of Holyrood's Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee highlighted the lengthy waits in a new report into Scotland's electricity infrastructure. They called on the Scottish Government to work with the UK and Welsh administrations as well as regulators of Ofgem and the National Grid to enshrine and publicly promote a policy of grid expansion. It comes as their report said Scotland was on a journey to net zero that requires an energy revolution, with the move away from oil and gas meaning the country will require a radically different energy mix. The committee insisted that an expanded national grid was a public good, as well as a direct and inevitable consequence of decarbonising our energy supply to achieve net zero. Going forward, they said there should be a principle of prudential investment in grid capacity in anticipation of future need, and to meet the Scottish Government's target of achieving net zero emissions by 2045. The report said a clear statement of intent about and plan of action for speeding up grid connection is also needed from governments. The MSPs said it's unacceptable that developers are being asked to wait upwards of a decade for a connection. It is also completely at odds with ambitions to grow a world-leading renewables sector. They went on to raise concerns that Scotland's planning system could be a major block on our net zero ambitions, with the MSPs saying momentum will be needed to build the generating capacity and transmission infrastructure needed. To tackle this, the committee called on Holyrood ministers to streamline and simplify the planning application process for renewable energy projects, although they also stressed the process must still provide for robust interrogation of any major proposal and give local people a say. MSPs stressed, as this report has made clear, an expanded national grid is a public good and a necessary one in response to the climate crisis. As a result, they said there was an urgent need for a national conversation led by the Scottish Government on what this change will mean for Scotland and its different regions. This work should be backed up by a long-term plan produced together with the network operators Ofgem and the National Grid, which will give a best estimate of the scale and type of new infrastructure that will be needed and where it's likely to go. This would mean that the public can see up front what changes are likely and reasons for them, the committee stated. Convener Edward Mountain said that those who had given evidence to the committee had agreed that much more electricity will need to be on the grid for us to meet our climate change goals. He stated urgent and bold changes are needed to both increase the grid's overall capacity and to speed up the rate of grid connection. This is why we are calling for a national conversation to take place which explains clearly how we are going to take carbon out of the energy supply, the choices available on how to get there, and what this could mean for people in their day-to-day lives. He added that the planning system needed to be more agile, reaching decisions on electricity and renewables projects more quickly, but also without removing any of the fundamental rights of individuals and communities to have their say and to influence the process. Mr. Mountain said, electricity infrastructure has a vital role to play as we face the climate emergency. But unless urgent action is taken by governments on both sides of the border, regulators and operators alike, it may well become an opportunity lost. Energy Secretary Neil Gray said, I'm grateful to the committee for its work. These recommendations are being considered as part of the Scottish Government's approach to finalising its energy strategy and just transition plan. Significant investment in our grid infrastructure is required to ensure clean, low-cost renewable energy can flow to where it's needed. Such infrastructure must be delivered with lasting benefits for our economy and for the people of Scotland. He added, while policy and regulation relating to electricity networks is reserved to the UK government, we must work together to enable a net zero power system which will drive down costs and increase benefits for its customers, businesses, workers and communities. And that was by Jodie Harrison. The Herald on the 12th of September and the news section. Renewables projects in Shetland and Orkney win CFD support by Mark Williamson. The decision by offshore wind farm developers to boycott the UK government's latest support round for renewables firms underlined the threat to hopes of a boom off Scotland. However, the remedies proposed by the administration's many critics could impose a heavy burden on energy bill payers across the UK, who are set to provide generous support for onshore wind in Scotland and the country's faltering tidal energy industry. The Department for Energy triggered a furore on Friday when it revealed that no offshore wind farm developers had applied for support under the fifth round of the flagship Contracts for Difference programme for renewables firms. The programme guarantees generators a minimum strike price for their output for 15 years and is reckoned to have played a key role in encouraging firms to take on the risks of developing assets. If market prices are below the strike prices agreed, CFD payments make up the difference. If market prices are above the strike price, generators pay over the excess. However, while the government runs a programme, householders have shouldered the financial burden concerned. The costs have been added to energy bills, which have surged since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Against that backdrop, it was no surprise that ministers wanted developers to accept strike prices they felt were likely to limit the net costs of the programme. Offshore wind farms, however, insisted the strike price targeted by the government did not take account of the hefty cost increases in essentials such as steel and the increases in interest rates that developers have faced in recent months. They decided to snub the CFD round to teach ministers a lesson. Another round will be held next year. Coming weeks after Vattenfall shelved plans for a giant wind farm off Norfolk, citing cost increases, critics said the round had left the government's hopes for a massive increase in offshore and wind generating capacity in support of the net zero drive in tatters. The implications for Scotland seem particularly alarming following years in which the renewables activity has failed to generate the scale of economic benefit expected. The landmark ScotWind licensing round completed in 2022 was expected to kickstart activity. It won support from giants such as BP, which proposed to develop wind farms that they assumed would benefit from CFD support. Days before the CFD round results were announced, Scotland's First Minister HUMZA YOUSAF put the onus on the UK government to help boost offshore activity. Announcing his programme for government, Mr YOUSAF appeared to suggest Prime Minister Rishi Sunak should mimic US President Joe Biden, who is providing billions of dollars tax relief for renewables firms under the Inflation Reduction Act. You only need to look at the United States or the European Union to see the way in which ambitious government and state support for green industries is helping to create new jobs, said Mr. YOUSAF. The inactivity of the UK government risks us falling behind an increasingly competitive race. Industry leaders in Scotland put the blame for the poor response to the CFD round from offshore developers firmly on Mr. Sunak's team. Scottish renewables boss Claire Mack lamented industry has repeatedly warned of the cost pressures and increasing challenges facing developers, but the UK government failed to heed these warnings and is now seeing the effect of that in action. Scottish Power Chief Executive Keith Anderson decried a multi-billion-pound loss opportunity to deliver low-cost energy for customers, which he said was a wake-up call for government. Mr. Anderson may have been influenced by the fact that Spanish-owned Scottish Power bid successfully for ScotWind acreage with Shell. The old giant signalled recently that it had concerns about the economics of the kind of big floating wind farms that it talked about developing off Scotland. Amid the brouhaha, it was striking, however, that nobody seemed to suggest that offshore wind farm developers may be being a bit greedy. The likes of Shell and Scottish Power have made huge profits following the rise in oil and gas prices in recent months. This has resulted in steep increases in householders' energy bills. Making the CFD regime more attractive for offshore and wind generators could increase the burden on bill payers. Consumer groups in the US reacted with concern to recent attempts by BP and Equinor to secure a reported 54% increase in the price they got for power from wind farms off New York. Reuters noticed the group that represented New York's largest energy consumers estimated the increases sought could add $14.8 billion, £12 billion, to bills over the 30-year life of the contracts concerned. While offshore wind farm developers sulked, the UK government noted that renewables generators working in fields such as onshore wind and tidal energy put themselves in line to get around £0.25 billion support under the latest CFD round. It approved bids in respect of a record 95 projects. The firms concerned must have been prepared to accept the relevant strike prices for their output. Scotland is set to be a big beneficiary of the latest CFD round. Some 24 onshore wind farm projects in Scotland won backing. These include SSE's controversial Viking development in Shetland. Support was also offered for 3 Highlands wind farm projects led by Perth-based SSE, which is not exactly hard up. In his programme for government, Mr. YOUSAF said he would speed up the planning process for onshore wind farms in Scotland, although residents in the area affected may oppose developments. 7 Scottish tidal energy projects won approval in the latest CFD round, including the Maygen Scream in the Pentland Firth. The projects look set to get particularly generous support. The strike price agreed was £198 per megawatt hour. Onshore wind farms were offered £52.29 per megawatt hour. Former First Minister Alex Salmond said tidal energy could help Scotland become the Saudi Arabia of the global renewable energy, only to see prominent sector players such as Polamis and Aquamarine Power fall into administration. But the generosity shown to tidal firms appealed to receive little attention last week as offshore wind champions looked to put the squeeze on Mr. Sunak. Critics include trade body Offshore Energies UK, which has played a prominent part in the campaign against the windfall taxes imposed by the Conservative government on oil and gas firms and electricity generators. In its latest economic report, the former Oil and Gas UK said, although there has been fast growth in renewable sources, their overall contribution to the UK's energy mix is only around 5%. Some might feel figures like that suggest the government can't afford to leave the vital task of maximising the contribution that low-carbon renewables make to energy security in the UK to corporations. And that was by Mark Williamson.
That concludes this week's edition of the Herald Scotland podcast. Please remember to subscribe to our channels at Tune Review. Tell your friends about our service.